All right, welcome back to the channel. All right, so this is going to be a video about why I believe the Devin Haney fight versus Devin Haney versus Gary Russell Jr. will not happen, and I'm going to tell you why I believe that it will not happen. And it's going to be something different than what most people think. In short, brief, I think the number one reason that this fight is not taking place is Floyd Mayweather Jr. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So, this is a video that I really didn't want to do, and one of the videos, one of the reasons why I don't like to interview fighters, I really don't like to be involved in, conversations about with actual boxers, actual managers and promoters. I really don't like to do it. And the reason that is in this conversation will show you why I don't like doing it. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is definitely one of the most powerful men in boxing. He's one of the most powerful men in the ring, and he's one of the most powerful men outside the ring. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the PBC. He created the PBC along with Al Heyman. His contract with Showtime Sports is the thing that launched the PBC. He was critical in defeating, basically had a battle with Oscar De La Hoya, took most of the fighters that were supposed to be signed, quote unquote, supposed to be signed by Golden Boy Promotions and brought them over to the PBC. So that is very relevant in this. I wanted to put that as the starting point because if there was ever a time that I wanted to like script out a video, this would be one, but it's just not going to be that. But let me get to the point. And thank you guys for coming. Much love for everybody that supports the channel. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. If you are subscribed, hit the bell icon. All that good old stuff. But like, this is a video that is very tough for me to do because I have a lot of appreciation for Gary Russell Jr. I have a lot of appreciation for Devin Haney. But at the same time, I have got to call it like I see it. And I am pretty sure that I'm pretty confident in what I believe can be defended, that my point of view can be defended. And here it is. I believe that Floyd Mayweather Jr. does not want Gary Russell Jr. to beat Devin Haney because that would go against Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s plans for Devin Haney. I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the only person that I can think of that would have the ability to block fights for Gary Russell Jr. Because if you have to compare the loyalty of a guy like Al Heyman to Floyd Mayweather versus Gary Russell Jr., I think you know where that is going to go. Gary Russell Jr. is not actually signed to the PBC. He is a free agent that is consulted by Al Heyman. But Al Heyman makes his money, his career, his name in boxing, that is, was made by Floyd Mayweather. So Al Heyman is somebody I think is fair to say is joined at the right hip of Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, also, who else is joined right at the hip of Floyd Mayweather Jr.? Devin Haney. Joined at the hip to Floyd Mayweather Jr. Trained in Vegas at Floyd Mayweather's gym. Trained by Floyd Mayweather's father. Even hired a trainer, Mickey Bay, that was considering suing Floyd Mayweather Jr. for improperly allowing his cousin, Dewan, to be the manager of Mickey Bay and freeze Mickey Bay and basically freeze Mickey Bay out of his career. That was an issue that took place several years ago, but now is reconciled. At least that's my remembrance. If somebody can tell me that's different, because this is just one incident, let it be known in the comment section, and I'll say, okay, I was wrong about Mickey Bay. But I'm pretty sure I remember Mickey Bay being extremely frustrated about the fact that he wasn't getting fights and that there was his cousin Dewan, don't remember what Dewan's name, used to be in the corner of Floyd Mayweather Jr., was his manager, which is really a violation of the Ali Act because the promoter was Mayweather. But regardless, now Devin Haney has a former guy that was signed to Mayweather Promotions in the camp working with Devin Haney. So Floyd Mayweather Jr., both parties, now watch, both parties, the DAZN side of it and the PBC side of it have connections to Floyd Mayweather. Floyd Mayweather Jr., not more than 2 months ago, had Devin Haney training him in the gym and had a beef with him and Gervonta Davis going back and forth about, oh, dude, who you riding with? You riding with Devin? And Floyd was like, look, man, Devin and Gervonta Davis aren't even going to fight each other because Devin's going to go to 147. Gervonta is going to be down here. So what do you think? What do you think Floyd Mayweather Jr. is trying to do? Trying to sign Devin Haney if he doesn't already have him signed. Because truth be told, the way that corporations work, and this is just somebody that's a businessman, right? And that's why I look at it this way. I've been in business a long time. I've worked with very large organizations. You very rarely in organizations do you get your first talk at a guy that is actually a decision maker. I talked to, and who were the first two people that I spoke to? This is just a rule that I have for myself. I don't get to talk to a lot of decision makers. Decision makers don't call me on the phone and start asking me my opinion. That's just my long-term experience dealing in government contracts, in sales, whatever the case was. If you're talking to the mayor and the mayor of a city is really the guy that is going to make the decision, right? You're not usually going to talk to the mayor. You're going to talk to his assistant. You're going to talk to somebody out there that knows him, that can communicate between the two of you. Which is why I started talking with Batman. And I also immediately was able to talk to Devin Haney's, the Bill Haney. So the way that I viewed that was common to my experience is that, like I said, in big deals, I've never been able to talk to the main guy right away. Me, because I'm not the one making the deal. I'm the one that is just, involved in like the documentation of it, right? So, but the major players, the guy that's the CEO of the company, for example, State Farm did a lot of business with great insurance company, did a lot of business with State Farm back in the day. I never met Ed Rust. Matter of fact, I never really even saw the department heads. I would see the people that the department said would send to come to me to get the information that they needed so that they could take that to their higher ups. And it might have been multiple committees of people to make that decision. So when Bill Haney was talking to me, I was like, yeah, I believe Bill Haney's making the fight, but I'm not fooled. I'm not saying I'm not fooled because I don't think anybody's trying to fool me, but I know that ultimately DAZN is going to have to make that decision. There are going to be people above that Bill Haney's going to have to go talk to. But see, we always assume that the people that he has to be okay with is just Eddie Hearn. But that's not true because he fights out of Mayweather Gym. Been training out of Vegas. Just because not every, Mayweather fighter has to be signed to the PBC. What would prevent you from having him sign with another? Just create another promotional company and have him go sign with DAZN, right? I mean, what's to say that all of, when Floyd Mayweather Jr. talks about how he's making $1 million a month and it's still coming in, how do we know that some of that stuff is not residuals? And more than likely, some of it is residuals from fights from other fighters that are at the PBC. Could be residuals from fights that people are not in the PBC. Somebody like Floyd Mayweather Jr., who's inventive and all that, can find ways to do that, right? So that's just from like I said, that's just anecdotal evidence. That's just me looking from the outside in. But to me, the most likely reason for this fight not being made is somebody like Floyd Mayweather doesn't want it because he has other plans for Devin Haney. And you can look at the fight that Devin Haney has on deck next. What fight does Devin Haney have next that is not Gary Russell Jr.? Yuriorkis Gamboa, right? He's picking between two PBC fighters. Who was the last person that Yuriorkis Gamboa Yuriorkis Gamboa fought? Gervonta Tank Davis, that was represented by who? Floyd Mayweather Jr., right? So now Yuriorkis Gamboa is going to be fighting a second PB, is going to fight a second guy that came out of Floyd Mayweather's gym, right? Gamboa is going to fight both Tank and Haney. Gamboa is going to fight two Floyd Mayweather Jr. associated fighters in a row. How does that happen? How lucky is that, right? And then think about this. Gary Russell Jr. wanted a Leo Santa Cruz fight. And they were like, oh, we just can't understand how this fight can't be made, right? Leo's ducking. But all of a sudden, Leo's fighting who? Gervonta Tank Davis. So if Floyd Mayweather Jr. has a lot of pull, right? And he does, with the Mayweather gym because he owns it, right? With the Haneys because his father's been training him since a kid. So I have to believe that Floyd has had relationships with Devin Haney since he was a little kid. So Floyd has, again, wheels on both sides, the Haney side and the Al Heyman side of the same negotiation. So I'm sitting there thinking, dude, like this is an in-house This is a Mayweather gym fighter, right? And Mayweather gym fighters are associated with Floyd Mayweather, who is associated with Al Heyman. And then you got a guy that is trying to deal with Al Heyman to get that fight, but people won't understand why the fight can't get made. Then on top of it, you add this ridiculous press push on Gary Russell Jr., right? Gary Russell Jr., even though Gary Russell Jr., and I'm telling you, this is nothing personal, and I'm not getting, like I said, I'm not doing any more interviews. You're not going to see people on my channel anymore because it's just at this point, come on, man. It's just kind of obvious. You know what I'm saying? It's just kind of obvious. You see people making videos about Gary Russell Jr.'s ducking, right? Bill Haney at the end talking to BFDB says, hey, man, at the end of this, we have to agree that either if this fight doesn't happen, either one person is ducking or the other person's ducking. That has to be the outcome. So I thought, and I listened to myself. I thought to myself, why does that have? Why would I want that to be the outcome? Right? Like reverse engineer it. Why would I want that to be the outcome? Why? Because why can't it be the PBC didn't want the fight and not Gary Russell Jr. doesn't want it? That's an outcome people could agree on, right? If Al Heyman doesn't want to make the fight, right, for whatever reason, and so they won't put up the money, and DAZN doesn't think the fight is interesting, and they won't put up the money, but Devin Haney and Gary Russell Jr. want to fight. That's not Gary Russell Jr. ducking, is it? No, it's the networks not making the fight, whether it's the PBC or the promotional outfits. It's either the PBC or it's DAZN. So what's with the insistence that it be Gary Russell Jr. ducking? And so I reversed engineered. I said, what interest would that serve? Oh, it allows Devin Haney to get away from Gary Russell Jr. and have the fight not take place because another champion won't fight Devin Haney. And then that builds Devin Haney's reputation as somebody that is ducked. That is some Floyd Mayweather Jr. bullshit. It's just some Floyd Mayweather Jr. stuff, okay? That's what he does. Like the smoke and mirrors type of stuff, right? Like, you know, I watched Devin Haney fight this dude. I listened to what people said, like what Gary Russell Jr. said about Devin Haney and about like why he would beat Devin Haney. And when I'm telling you, I listened to Gary Russell Jr. himself. And then I went to the tape and watched it with an educated eye. And I see Gary Russell Jr. is a very bad matchup for Devin Haney at this point in time in his career. Devin Haney cocks back on his punches, and he's fighting guys that plod forward at him that allow him to set traps for him, right? They plod in, he sets his feet, he's faster than them. Right when he sets his feet, the guy's hands here, boom, he makes him walk into punches, right? So the guy's coming forward, Devin Haney stops, right? So not only does he have the power coming forward, the guy's momentum coming forward, he has his, and he times them, and boom, and it adds power to his punches, right? But the problem with that is that when I saw him fight Shakur Stevenson, a guy who was a pot shotter himself, Shakur Stevenson, and that was in the training session. The pot shotter was pot shotting Devin left, right, front, and center, and Devin was following him around. So that guy of the level of Gary Russell Jr., nah, dude, that's not going to fit, man. So that's my take on the matter. I don't think Devin Haney is ducking. I don't think Gary Russell Jr. is ducking. I don't think Floyd Mayweather Jr. wants to fight. And I don't think if Floyd doesn't want to fight, right, because he's got some beef with Gary Russell Jr., or Gary Russell doesn't fit into the plan that he has for developing Devin Haney's career, right? And I said Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s plan for developing Devin Haney's career. If that does not fit that plan, then Gary Russell Jr. doesn't get the fight, because they are much more interested over the long haul in getting Devin Haney to be the next Floyd Mayweather Jr., the next major pay-per-view star, and having him lose to a featherweight, right? A featherweight would not work well. And he's not ready for Gary Russell Jr., not in the level of experience that he has. He might, in his natural talent, soon get to that point, or his physical size might cause problems, but the skill gap between the two, there's a skill gap between the two. And I think Floyd knows that. And that's my take, man. I don't want to do any more interviews on it or anything, but it just seems like that Floyd Mayweather Jr. that Gary Russell Jr. is not, he's not in the in crowd in Vegas, right? So he's not going to be treated fairly on channels that videographers and videos that rely on Vegas for their content. So if people are going to Vegas, visiting Vegas, right, acting like, dude, who lives there? Who runs that? Who runs boxing in Vegas? Like, from black people. That's Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s town. So it just seems like, no, man, there's just no. I don't think the fight's going to happen, dude. And I think there's just silly gamesmanship. And I really don't think that this was ever a good faith negotiation. That's my opinion. I don't think they negotiated with Gary Russell Jr. in good faith. I think Gary Russell Jr. Negotiated in good faith, but I don't see that from and I don't even want to put it on Bill Haney. I don't want to put it on Bill Haney, because Bill Haney is the father, he's the trainer, and he's the mouthpiece. Just like Gary Russell Jr. Had a mouthpiece in Batman. Floyd Mayweather Jr. I think Floyd Mayweather Jr. got a mouthpiece in not just Bill Haney, but big boxing channels that are just on a go get 'em type of thing with Gary Russell Jr. So there you go, man. It's a long video. You let me know what you think. That's my take on the matter, and it's all my opinion. You can like it, you can not like it. But with that, I'm out. Peace.